gosh. No one wants to listen to that.
I know. Shh. This is the best part. You know what that is? That's if the book of Joel was just audio.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Admittedly, that's not the strongest way to start this episode, or the least disturbing way.
And if you haven't read the book of Joel, you have no idea what we're talking about.
No.
And so maybe a few of you listeners actually read Joel chapter 1 and might have some inkling what this crazy man next to me is doing.
You know what just happened to our listeners right now? They went, "Oh, that's fascinating. What is that sound you're making?"
No, they didn't.
Can I tell you what that was? That was the sound of 100,000 locusts swarming the countryside of Israel. That's what that sound was.
That's what it was supposed to be.
That is what it was. It was an onomatopoeia, Kelly.
Yes, Joel
welcome
chapter 1.
to Clearly. We are in Joel chapter 1, and we got to find something to smile about here, because Joel 1 is a bleak moment.
It is.
Isn't it?
It is. It opens with a proclamation of utter destruction.
Yeah.
And an encouragement to pass that news on to generations after you.
Now, listen, we're being tongue-in-cheek, but also this is God's word. And this is one of the things we're committed to on Clearly. It's like, no matter what it is in God's word, it matters for us. God has something to say to us. And he has something to say to you today, even using locusts, which likely sound nothing like what I did
Probably not.
a little bit earlier. But join us, and let's see what the Lord has for us in the text of Joel chapter 1.
So we are in Joel chapter 1, and we're going to dig in to all of the chapter, all the way through verse 20. We're going to talk through it. And what's different about this, normally I'm the one with you guys walking through the text of Scripture. And this time I was like,
drum roll.
Oh my gosh. It's like, I want you to do Joel with me. And so.
And I said yes, guys.
Yes.
I said yes. $50 later, I said yes.
And honestly, this is what we do on our date nights. I know that makes us sound nerdy, but I'm not lying.
Welcome to our date night.
It's not the only thing we
gentlemen.
talk about, but it is a frequent occurrence with just what we're studying in the Bible that we just find it really fascinating together to just go, hey, I was reading this, and what did you think? So we're going to just talk through it.
Let's do it.
Some of the things that we noticed. And
Pop quiz, Kelly.
Yes.
What does the name Joel mean?
I have no idea.
Unreal.
Wow, I didn't think to look that up. Do you have an answer for that?
No, I have no idea. No, I looked it up.
Oh, okay.
No, it means Yahweh is God.
Oh, okay.
It's like the most spiritual name in the world.
Yeah.
God, Lord God.
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Do you know what his father's name, Pethuel, is?
It means cheese
No,
is
you don't.
delicious.
He doesn't know. Okay.
In French, of all languages.
He does not know.
Okay.
Can I just read verses 1 through 5?
Yes.
And then can we talk about it? Does that work?
Yeah, do it.
All right. So this is Joel chapter 1. The word of the Lord that came to Joel, the son of Pethuel. Hear this, you elders. Give ear, all inhabitants of the land. Has such a thing happened in your days, or in the days of your fathers? Tell your children of it, and let your children tell their children, and their children to another generation. What the cutting locust left, the swarming locust has eaten. What the swarming locust left, the hopping locust has eaten. What the hopping locust left, the destroying locust has eaten. Awake, you drunkards, and weep, and wail, all you drinkers of wine, because of the sweet wine, for it is cut off from your mouth. Okay, let's stop right there.
Anybody else getting the warm fuzzies yet?
This is why we don't read this book.
People.
But, okay, can I just tell you something that I noticed that I thought was really interesting, is there's the opening commands are to hear and tell. I thought that was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Hear something, give your ear to it, and then tell it. And it's hear first the elders, then hear everyone, all the inhabitants of the land, and then tell it. And then he mentions 4 generations that you should tell it to.
Yep.
So it's like intense. You pay attention. Nothing like this has ever happened, and you tell it to your children so that they will tell their children, and they will tell their children who will tell their children. It's like there's this is really important. And then we start talking about what should be told, and it is utter destruction. Like that to me is so...
A plague of locusts.
What's the thing I'm supposed to tell? That there are these 4 different kinds of locusts that are totally and utterly destroying whatever one swarm ate, another swarm left, whatever they ate. I mean, it's just like, how else can you communicate something has been utterly destroyed? And I just was like, okay, that's really interesting that's, Lord, what you would want them to tell.
Yeah, a pretty dramatic opening to
it is.
To book 2. And it's interesting. There's immediately questions that are showing up in my mind, and I think interesting things to notice too. One of them is just the fact that I don't know where your mind goes when you hear locusts, but mine typically goes to Egypt.
Yep. Plagues in Egypt.
With the Exodus. And here we have a locust plague happening, but it's unfolding on who? It's unfolding on the people of God themselves, right? So now this is Israel dealing with a locust plague. And I just think there's no way a reader of this, and certainly anyone who's experiencing this in Judah at that time, is not putting those dots together. Hey, I thought this is supposed to happen to our enemies,
right?
And it's not. It's happening to us. Typically, like when plague-like things are going on in the Old Testament, there's like big red flags flying everywhere, right? Like when there's a famine in the land, your brain as an Israelite would have gone straight back to like Deuteronomy 28, where the blessings and curses are laid out. And it's like, hey, if you guys are rebelling against Yahweh, there's going to be famine. It's going to be bad. So like a plague is coming. A plague is there. It's destroyed
it's
everything.
Already happening.
And I think every Israelite's mind is going, oh, this isn't for us normally. This is for our enemies, and here we are.
And we don't worry that much about locusts because
Speak for yourself, sister.
Most of us are not farmers. But if you're if you're in a country and in a time where
like an agrarian,
currency, the currency is crops, and like that is that's your food, that's your livelihood. I mean, this is a big deal. So just to say, we don't really...
Yeah, their economy's wiped out.
Yes.
Yeah, it's their Wall Street. I mean,
exactly.
It's March 2020. It's
right.
That's what's happening.
It would be the equivalent of that. It's like, this is destroying everything. And we kind of go, okay, so what? All the land is eaten up. It's like, well, that's a big deal. That affects everything.
That's right. And let's talk about the extent of it. It's because they go into detail about that. It talks about the locusts, and verse 7 says, it's made my vine a waste, my fig tree splinters, it's stripped them bare, cast them away, their branches have become white. Later on, it's going to talk about the field. Verse 10 is ruined, the land mourns, the grain is ruined, new wine dries up, fresh oil fails. I mean, this is it's a picture of a barren wasteland. Verse 12, it's reiterating a lot of the same themes. The vine dries up, fig tree fails, pomegranate, palm also, the apple tree, the trees of the field, they dry up.
Well, and then verse 17, the seed shrivels under the clods, storehouses are desolate, granaries are torn down because there's no grain to put in them. So much so that then the beasts are mourning in verse 18, and the herds of cattle are perplexed, and because there's no pasture left for them.
This isn't a main point, but I just see a cow in the field just going,
the cow is perplexed.
What's happening here, Mildred? Right,
but it's caused, problems with not just the land, but then with the animals that depend on the land, which of course the people depend on the animals as well as the land. And so this opening of locusts coming in 4 different swarms, while in 2022, we're not worried about locusts. This is the beginning of just utter desolation to the land in a way that's very profound. And this is the thing that God opens and says, hear this and tell this to your children. This is what I want you to tell, that this has happened in Israel, not in Egypt, in Israel.
That's good.
And that is heavy.
Yeah, all day. One thing that we should probably address is most commentators are going to agree that this chapter 1, the locust here is not figurative, though this book is poetic literature. All indications here are of an actual locust plague. I just want to say that because sometimes we can, in prophetic literature, in poetic literature, we can poeticize a thing and go, oh, this must mean the locust of their sin. But no, most scholars are going to look at this and agree that, no, these are actual locusts. Joel is commenting on an actual plague that's taking place within the nation of Judah at the time.
Which I think makes sense with so much of the other land language in the rest of this chapter. It's so focused on fields being destroyed, ground being dried up, like the consequences you're seeing that are being brought to light. And I don't know if that's why commentators say that. I don't know if you did. I didn't look deeply into that, but that's what made me make that assumption that these locusts are actual locusts, is because the rest of this chapter is so focused on the land, the actual land being destroyed. That to me is a repeated idea through this chapter, which is always a good way to tell what's happening in this book. What repeated themes, ideas, words are happening. And in almost, it feels like every other verse is vine, fig tree, field, ground, barley, harvest, pomegranate. I mean, it's about the land. And honestly, that's how it opens, right? Give ear all inhabitants of the land. I just think that's interesting that it chose that word. It's talking about a physical place that has experienced desolation.
And don't forget, the land, that term is so pregnant in the Old Testament. It's not just like a plot of ground somewhere. It's not just where the Israelites happen to be living at that point. When you're talking about the land, you're talking about God's promised territory to his people. I mean, this is the land that's been promised from the jump, from Genesis 12 and 15 and 17 and onwards. So like when God's very land that he intends to pour out his blessing on his people is experiencing this kind of devastation, all the red flags need to show up again. I mean, that's a very big deal. It says my land is being invaded. Now, here's one little confusing thing for us that, again, it's what makes a book like Joel tricky. You read in verse 6, so we were just talking about the locust being real locust, but then you read in verse 6, it says, for a nation has invaded my land, mighty and without number. Its teeth are like teeth of a lion. It goes on. What I think Joel is doing here, when you read the whole book of Joel, you know that we're about to move from, and we'll talk about this later, but we're about to move from this very real plague with very real locusts to Joel borrowing this imagery to talk about something that the Lord in later days is going to do. And I think he's introducing language like this of a nation because he's setting himself up for chapter 2 and chapter 3, because in chapter 2 we're going to meet a nation that there's disagreement about it, but very likely this is an actual nation that we're talking about now. We're out of sort of real locust territory and into locust being imagery pointing forward to something else. And so I think Joel sneaks that word in there because he's going to be setting up a bigger point that this is not just a book about a plague that's happening. Right. I want to tell you something bigger that's on the horizon, right?
So all this information has just been given. And then we're given this command in verse 8. And I'll just read 8 through 10. It says, lament like a virgin wearing sackcloth for the bridegroom of her youth. The grain offering and the drink offering are cut off from the house of the Lord. The priests mourn, the ministers of the Lord. The fields are destroyed, the ground mourns because the grain is destroyed. The wine dries up, the oil languishes. So in light of all this, the command is to lament. And again, we just don't do that very well. We want to move on to happier times. We want to tie bows on things. We want to fix it. We want to get about the work of restoration. But the command given here in light of the destruction is to pause and cry, to lament something, to grieve something. And the imagery that was given, I think, is really like, again, it just gave us imagery of how to lament. So we're supposed to take a second and think about what that would look like. And the imagery that's given is a young bride before her wedding day has lost her groom. He has died. That's what I'm assuming this would mean. I don't know what you think, but like a virgin, meaning she's not married yet, wearing sackcloth for the bride of her youth. So this is like an engaged woman preparing for her wedding day, and her groom has died, and she is mourning that.
And it's interesting that in verse 9, and you had mentioned this earlier, but the grain offering, the drink offering are cut off from the house of the Lord. So this is not just affecting agricultural life. It's not just affecting, like we saw a few verses back where it's like the drunkard can't get drunk anymore.
Right.
It's like, well, that is a byproduct. If you got no more wine, guys can't get drunk. But here you have the actual practice of sacrifices and offerings to the Lord can't take place. So the actual worship of Yahweh is being inhibited by this awful plague.
Right. As
a side note, by the way, this mention of the house of the Lord is one of the indicators for us trying to kind of place this book, like when was it written? It's giving us some type of indication, along with other indications that, the temple was in existence.
Right.
And we don't know if it was Solomon's temple or if it was like after the exile temple, but we know at least from this verse that there was a temple with the offerings being made, and so that gives us some sort of sense of bearing on our time. So,
But yeah, that's one of the reasons given for the mourning is because of this destruction of the land, the worship has been destroyed along with it. The worship of God. And it specifically mentions grain and drink offerings here, which I think is intentional. There were other offerings, right? And if you look at Leviticus, there were burnt offerings, sin offerings, wave offerings. But here, two are mentioned that would specifically be brought from the fruit and produce of the land. Drink offerings would have been oil or wine poured out. Grain offerings would have been grain from the land. And so because the land is destroyed, the things that we would be bringing to honor God don't exist anymore. And that is a tragedy worth lamenting. And we'll see it come up again. But
that's right.
But yes, it's affecting the worship of God. And part of the people who are lamenting and mourning, it says here in verse 9, are the priests and the ministers of the Lord are
That's
mourning.
Right. In fact, Joel's about to tell the priests in verse 13, hey, priests, gird yourselves with sackcloth and lament. Wail, O ministers of the altar. Come, spend the night in sackcloth, O ministers of my God. And he gives the reason for the grain offering, the drink offering are withheld from the house of your God. You're going to notice as you read Joel, just like in a song, again, if this is poetry, we know how does a song work? Well, the chorus shows up 2 or 3 times, right? And so that's what you're experiencing. So don't just write it off as like, oh, they said this already. You got to remember they're training the listeners to know what to care most about. That's what, when you have a song, what the chorus is doing, what the hook is doing is it's saying, this is what it's about. This is what you got to focus on. And and so if you notice as you're reading, man, this keeps coming back up. This keeps coming back up. You can almost say to yourself, okay, this is kind of like a chorus, right? In the song, this is kind of like reminding me to like pay attention. This is one of the very important features that this poet, if you will, is putting into this this piece for me to pay attention to.
Yep. So it moves on from there in verse 11 with more commands. There's lots of imperative verbs here that are very similar to lament. You have be ashamed, O tillers of the soil. Wail, O vine dressers, another command to cry about something. For the wheat and the barley, because the harvest of the field has perished. The vine dries up, the fig tree languishes. Pomegranate, palm, and apple, all the trees of the field are dried up. That's our third reference to something being dried up, by the way. And gladness dries up from the children of man. So then we see this transition into wailing over the drying up of the land and all of the fruits of the land that would have been something the Israelites probably would have been really proud of. Like, this goes beyond just basic grain for bread. He's mentioned pomegranates, palms, apples. These probably would have been like things you might think about your own city. I'm so proud of our whatever.
Street tacos.
We have the
okay.
Street tacos.
We got good street tacos.
Just what you're known for, right? The things that you would prize as produce of your land that would be a type of pride, which is why I think you have this comment to be ashamed, because your pride has been lost as you've lost these things in the land.
It's embarrassing,
right?
As well as like destroying, crops.
Destroying
and
these
things
things that are beautiful,
There's
which then
an embarrassment about it.
the gladness dries up from the children of men. Like that what's happening to the land is affecting the hearts of the people. And this is a reason to cry. And then, like you said, it goes back into this theme of worship, put on sackcloth and lament.
Yeah.
Priests, wail. Again, there's a command to cry, which we don't lament very well in our modern day. We don't pause and cry over things. But it's just interesting to me here that the commands God's given are telling the people to, before you go, there's no commands to fix things yet, right? To do the things that the commands are to do are so far to hear something, to tell something, and to wail. I'm just looking at what I've underlined.
Consecrate a fast. Yeah.
Lament, be ashamed, wail, put on sackcloth, lament, pass the night in sackcloth. Consecrate a fast, call a solemn assembly, gather the elders, cry out to the Lord. These are the types of commands that God is asking his people for in the midst of tragedy. And those are really hard for us to do because we want to get about the work of doing something about it. And God has kind of said, pause and be in sorrow and grieve and mourn over what's happening. That there's something really healthy for our hearts, I think, in doing that.
Yeah, and I'm glad you're saying this because a few episodes ago we talked about what can feel like the opposite of this, which is don't just feel a thing, do something, right? When we were looking at 1 Samuel and David going and retrieving the ark, and I think this is a good counterbalance to go, but before you do a thing, feel a thing. That's very true as well in Scripture. Also, I think it's interesting to note, can God command emotions? Can God demand of you an emotion? Apparently, yes, right? We know that the Bible is repeatedly saying, rejoice in the Lord. That's a sentiment, right? And here he's saying, cry. He's looking at you and he's saying, cry now, right? It's like, that's just interesting to know. Does God command behaviors? Yes. Does he command emotions? Apparently, yes, he does. He expects you to do that as well. And that's where I would say we need the help of the Spirit to do that. Absolutely. And then can we switch gears for a moment? Because we're coming up on verse 15. In verse 15, the gears start to shift. We start seeing what the author is up to. We start to see the language and the verbs change from a thing that has happened and the repercussions of that and the feelings we're to feel in it to something that's going to happen, right? Because in verse 15, it says this, out of all of that, it says, alas for the day of the Lord is near, and it will come as destruction from the Almighty. So all of a sudden we have all these future tense verbs showing up. It will come as destruction. The day of the Lord is near. And then there's just the phrase itself, the day of the Lord.
Right.
Everybody, you should just, like all the light bulbs should go on. Like the day of the Lord is a very significant term, especially in the prophets and especially in the book of Joel. Were you going to say something?
No. I mean, besides that, the day of the Lord is near, and it's a connecting word to connect to these two ideas. The day of the Lord is near, and as destruction from the Almighty it comes. So that's one of those difficult things we talked about this book is we don't like to read about destruction coming from God. We like to see blessing coming from God. We want to see our bank accounts increase, not decrease. We want to see our land growing fruitful, not drying up. And here we see destruction coming from the Almighty. And again, that's meant to correct any theology we have that is misplaced, that God is not at times the author and initiator of destruction. He is here. He claims that. He says destruction from the Almighty.
Yep.
And that's uncomfortable. I know that has a lot of things attached to it. But I think at a bare minimum, it should produce in us conversation with God. We are meant to read the Bible relationally. We have access in Jesus to the author of this book. These challenging things can make us just stop and stay away from God. But I think they're meant, at least for me, this is how I handle them first. Before I have any answers, I talk to him.
That's great. I think that's such good counsel for us as we're studying. Yeah, because so many of us don't know what to do when we're reading stuff. We just want to shut down. But I think the invitation is right. Let's just take it to the Lord. Let's just talk to him. Right? That's the appropriate rhythm.
Right.
And so verse 15 happens, and we get this first mention of the day of the Lord. I think that phrase, the day of the Lord, appears 4, maybe 5 times in the book of Joel, and this is its first appearance. And again, it's providing some connective tissue between what's happened in chapter 1 to everything that's coming in chapter 2. Because when we get to chapters 2 and 3, we're going to hear about similar impending destructions and an army coming, and it's going to sound a little bit like the Locusts thing, but it's going to have some other language, more military-like language in there. And a thoughtful reader gets to thinking, wait, are we talking about something new here? And when we get to chapter 2, we'll discuss that. And, are we talking about something new, or is this just more on the locust theme? But what I think, I'll just show my cards and say what I think is happening is Joel is taking a very real event that's happening in the life of Judah, immense suffering, devastation of the land, and he's saying, hey, and just so you know, now we're going to talk future tense verbs, just so you know, there's a day that's coming. It's called the day of the Lord, and it will come as destruction from the Almighty. What you're seeing here is a little parable of something that is coming one day. And I want to warn you about that. That's what the prophetic literature, by and large, is doing. And so when we get to chapter 2, it's going to start making more sense, because chapter 2 is opening with a warning to Zion about the day of the Lord that is coming. It says, surely it is near. So just know that's where we're heading. We're getting geared up for the author to sort of turn the page and make more sort of eschatological sense of things, right? Looking to the future things to come.
Eschatology.
Eschatology
means
study of the last things.
The last things, future things. If you didn't know, that's a very big word that you nerdy seminary people use. Can I read the last 2 verses in this chapter?
Yeah.
Because it kind of takes a shift here in verse 19. For the first time, we see the pronoun you appear.
Good observation, Kelly.
Those pronouns.
You should start a podcast. Hear me out. Let's call it. All right, go ahead.
But seriously, pronouns matter in the Bible because they tell you a lot. But yeah, this is how I know something has shifted, because this started with the word of the Lord that came to Joel. And so by and large, we've been hearing from the Lord through the mouth of Joel. And here something interesting happens. This is just verse 19 and 20, the last 2 verses. To you, O Lord, I call, for fire has devoured the pastures of the wilderness, and flame has burned all the trees of the field. Even the beasts of the field pant for you. There's the second mention of you. Because the water brooks are dried up, and fire has devoured the pastures of the wilderness. It's repetitive, but just to point out, Joel seems to be doing what we just talked about, taking what's happening to God. That here, this is kind of a prayer here, ending chapter 1. To you, O Lord, I call. That there is a calling out to God. And the reason he says he's calling out, he gives the reason. Fire is devoured the pastures. Flame has burned. The beasts pant for you, God. Water is dried up. So in light of all this, he's just bringing this utter desolation to God and modeling, I think, lament and wailing. There's a modeling here at the end of what has been called for, a crying out to God to end chapter 1.
Yeah.
And I think, even if we don't fully understand everything being referenced, and we're going to talk about it when we get to chapter 2, when I think about what does this mean for me, what is this modeling for me? I have a lot of questions, and you maybe do too. A lot of things I'm like, what was all that about? I don't know what to do with it, and I can't relate to much of it. But here's something we can relate to. Destruction has come. Something very difficult has happened, and God's command has been, come tell me about it.
That's good.
Lament, cry, come to me, cry out to the Lord, and these are books that have informed that for me, that when we have experienced losses, when we've experienced hardship, when I have, or we have together, it's a reminder there's something good and lovely that pleases God for me to pause and not pray as I'm going in my car and not pray as I'm washing dishes, but like actually stop and cry and get on my knees in my house somewhere and just tell God about the tragedy that's in front of me and bring it to him. And that is actually something valuable, worth my time, and godly and commanded in this book. And I might not be facing locusts, and you might not either, and you might not be facing fields on fire and whole nations coming to destroy your plot of land that you live on. But we all face different types of suffering and hardship. And here we have just a model for lament as something valuable that God would ask of us in seasons like this. And again, that's not all he will ask. We will see that, but that can be a really valuable place to start. Thanks for joining us today on Clearly, working through Joel chapter 1, man. What an interesting chapter in our scriptures.
What a chapter.
And next time we're getting into chapter 2, and it's got so much glorious goodness in it. It's got some heart in it. I hope that you'll tune in next time and walk with us through that as we get into some of the purposes of God's pronouncements of judgment, and we'll see a little bit of his heart in it as well. So I'm really excited about that. I hope you will maybe read ahead a little bit in Joel chapter 2 and then join us next time.
That's right. If you're liking this podcast and what we're doing here, why don't you become a partner with us on Patreon? I don't know if you've heard of that, but that's a way to partner up with us in the ministry that we got going here at Clearly, and really all the avenues that we are operating in. You can go to patreon.com, search for Jimmy and Kelly Needham, and partnering with us not only enables us to continue to give you episodes like this, but it also gives you access, kind of insider access to the making of these episodes. You get to participate with us. We do Q&As live with a Zoom audience for every episode, and we'd love for you to be a part of it. So if that sounds cool and interesting, then head to patreon.com, search Jimmy and Kelly Needham. You'll find us there, become a partner, and let's do this thing.
We'll see you guys next time.